So we have we wait another minute for people to join, or
19 panelists and 12 attendees.
Okay, and Mayor, we have about 19 of an expected 30 panelists on, so yeah, I guess whenever you're ready.
okay, thank you, and just want to thank everyone for joining us tonight. Appreciate your interest in this. Sorry, getting a little feedback there from somebody's microphone, but again, I want to thank you on behalf of the city. It's a major project we're undertaking here, and we appreciate time and effort you're putting in, and want your frank comments and thoughts on this process as we move forward. And with that, I'll turn it over to Chief Clifford.
Thank you, Mayor. Before I get into what the role and responsibilities are of our policymakers and steering committee, one thing I just wanted to mention is that I want everybody to know that during these conversations, we are listening and we're learning. But if a topic is brought up, if it's something that catches our attention that we feel it does not meet our expectations, something that we are as a police agency doing, we are going to look into it. So I just want to let everybody know that. Feel free to share your experiences, and it is something that we will follow up on. As far as the role and responsibilities of our policymaker group and our steering committee, again, we are here to listen and learn. But if you need to speak, or if anybody has a question for us, we will respond. Our panelists who are joining us, the conversation is for them to have and to drive. But our steering committee members who are faith-based are going to be elevated to panelists tonight. So if you have something that you would like to say, of course, we would like to hear it. And with that, I will turn it over to Jason.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Chief, and good evening, everyone. It's an honor and pleasure to be on the call with you tonight. I just want to go over a couple of housekeeping things before we get into the meat of the conversation. But this evening, if anyone feels that they are in need of any type of resource as far as speaking to someone after the call, or if this call brings up anything that we don't want to leave hanging in the space, we do have Reverend Anthony Green on the call with us today, and Reverend Green has agreed, thankfully and graciously, to stay on the call after. The likelihood that anybody on this call tonight will need to just have some counsel and somebody to talk to after the call. In addition to that, the Schenectady County Office of Community Services has also agreed to provide support, though their line is not staffed after hours, but a voice message can be left and they will follow up with proper services. And again, that's the Office of Community Services, and that number is 518-386-2218. Again, 518-386-2218. So tonight is the second of our community conversations, and I want to change it up a little bit this evening. We had quite a few people on the first call, and we realized that we weren't able to get to many of the questions that were prepared. So I'm going to switch up the way in which the flow will be this evening. I have a prepared kind of opening statement that I read on the first call in more detail, though I think I'm going to just kind of give you a more abbreviated version of that intro today, and then really allow time for us to hear from you all, get to the conversation and be able to hit on all the topics. So I will ask that as we get into the question round, what took up quite a bit of time on the last call was that everyone ran around the room and introduced themselves before we even started the question. So to switch that up a little bit, and again, to be able to get to more questions this evening, what I'm going to do is put a question out there, and then ask folks, whoever would like to respond to it, to do so, and maybe before answering the question, briefly introducing yourself and the organization that you represent. And we hope that everybody will find time to speak at least once on the call tonight, and this way we will be able to introduce everyone who's on the call. But we just feel that that's a little bit of a pivot for us to be able to get to more questions on this list. So with that, my name is Jason Benitez, and I currently serve as, I go by he and him pronouns, and I currently serve as the Vice President of Talent and Inclusion with the Capital Region Chamber. Again, this is going to be an amended version, but I humbly come before this group and the work that we're charged to do with the best of intentions and a sincere willingness to do what we can to produce meaningful, needed change. A little bit about me: I was born and raised in Brooklyn, New York City, came up to UAlbany in the mid-90s, got my degrees at UAlbany, and then prior to joining the chamber last year, I spent 15 plus years in higher education at 3 local institutions: UAlbany, SUNY Schenectady, and most recently Union College. And my work in particularly at Union College was expressly in regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And my work often entailed having difficult conversations with people with different perspectives and being able to kind of walk folks and meet them where they are and walk through those conversations. So again, I humbly come before this group in this responsibility of navigating these conversations. We are here to kind of move the executive order by Governor Cuomo to really take a deep dive into police and community relations in a way that's going to be able to hopefully produce meaningful policy change at the end of this process. So your input is integral to that. We are doing what we can to have a fairly representative group of stakeholders on these calls, and we're certainly doing what we can to center the voices of people of color in particular on these calls, given the disparities that exist currently and historically. So we really feel that if we can have some meaningful conversations and really move this issue forward, that we can really produce some meaningful change at the end of this process. We have to be willing to listen and let others be the experts of their own lived experiences, and really just listen with open minds and hearts. And I would close my opening statement again. This is a much briefer version than I initially gave. I would just close by stating that we are individuals, though many of these issues are systemic, with generations of history to these chapters of the story. So no one task force or one conversation is going to be able to fully undo all of the issues that are there, but we choose to stay engaged nonetheless, and we're here nonetheless. And it is our hope that these conversations can really shed some light on the report that will be generated at the end of this process, and then ultimately shifting policies and procedures and practices. I would just like to kind of personally thank you all in the faith community for historically what you represent to our communities. I am keenly aware that those in the faith community have historically and remain to be central to social movements. There is a long and deep history of those from faith backgrounds being able to put ideological differences aside and come together in the name of justice. You provide refuge when necessary, you provide counsel when necessary, and very often our community members open up to you in ways and share things with you that they may not with others. So I am aware of the supportive presence that you all bring to our community, and also the voices that you hear from, listen to, and hopefully can elevate through our conversation this evening. So that's just a brief kind of thank you to you all for your service and faith and being on the call tonight. So with that, I would like to go over some of our community conversation guidelines. Again, in an effort to be able to get to more questions this evening, I'm going to not go over every single one of these, but just highlight a few of the important ones. So following on the screen, speaking your own truth with care, using being authentic and honest as possible, and being aware and mindful of the impact that our words can have on others. Assuming positive intent coming to the space tonight, assuming that everybody is here to have meaningful, constructive, and productive dialogue. One mic, one person, so one person speaking at a time. The ouch, oops policy. If someone hurts your feelings or says something tonight, I encourage someone to say ouch. The other person will say oops, and then we can together debrief where that rub came from. I'd like to publicly thank, it was either Michaela Foster or Jamaica Miles. I'm pardon me if I'm confusing. There was a point on the last call where they were logged in under the same name. But previously, I had used language that was ableist. I had used the term move in and move back. And it was brought to my attention that that terminology is ableist, assuming that people can move and are able-bodied. And I understand that, and I took the suggestion and I listened, and I've changed that to lean in and lean back. And what that means is if you don't speak up often, try to lean into the dialogue. But if you do tend to speak a lot, try to lean back and let others speak. However, try to remain actively engaged throughout the entire conversation. I would like to thank Michaela Foster and Jamaica Miles for pointing that out, and then use this as a little bit of a learning moment to say that this is what diversity and inclusion looks like. We set the table, kind of, so to speak, with these discussion guidelines in a way that we felt everybody would be able to participate. And one of our members came to that table realizing that the language that we used on one of the bullet points was not as inclusive as it could be. So rather than get defensive, I listened. I'm open to being corrected. I'm open to hearing opinions. And then we changed it and hopefully are utilizing more inclusive language moving forward. And I just point that out as an example of kind of the scope of what this whole task force is to do, is charged to do, to come together, to listen, and to try to move forward in a more inclusive way. Stay with any discomfort that you might have this evening. You know, reflect on it and think about what it might be telling you. I want to say there's a lot of talk about creative space and brave spaces, but we'll do our best to have this be a safer space. It's not always going to be comfortable, but it does mean safe. You may be challenged, and we hope that you're courageous enough to stay in the conversation, respecting yourself, respecting others, and speaking your truth with care. Again, I'm giving a quicker version of this evening because I want to be able to get to the questions, but the last thing I'll kind of just close on is many of these issues that we're going to discuss tonight are institutional and systemic and are not necessarily the fault of those in this room. However, it is our collective responsibility to actively eradicate the problems within the systems we will be discussing. So if you would like to kind of read a fuller version of the discussion guidelines, they're there for your perusal. But I'd like to just hop right into it and get into the question phase of this evening. So again, I'm going to read a question, and anybody that would like to respond to it will indicate such. First, let me change my view to tile view so I can see more of you on my screen here. And then we will, again, try to get to as many of the questions as possible this evening. So bear with me while I just pull up the first question. And again, anyone can answer, and we ask you to quickly introduce yourself and the organization that you represent this evening before responding. So let's just start with a kind of a preliminary question. From your perspective, how would you describe the current status of the relationship between the Schenectady Police and the wider community? How would you describe the current status of the relationship? Anyone want to kick us off?
I was
Yes, and
I was
please.
trying to lean back. So you know, my name is Dustin Wright. I'm a pastor at Messiah Lutheran Church, and I'm here representing Schenectady Clergy Against Hate, a nonpartisan, multi-faith, and interfaith coalition working to promote harmony, respect, and fellowship in the greater Schenectady area. The way that I would describe that relationship is, frankly, one where we have a police force made up of incredibly dedicated and talented officers and staff, but are also folks who are caught up in an antiquated system of policing. So as a clergy person who was quite involved in a lot of the actions this past summer, sort of being a presence of peace, asked to be there on both sides, I saw, except for one major incident that I addressed with Chief Clifford and Sheriff D'Agostino, professionalism on behalf of individual officers. On the other hand, though, I recognize that it's in my own lifetime when I was addressing mental health stuff as a young teen that it was something to be ashamed of. We're only beginning to scratch the surface of addressing an addiction as a public health concern rather than something in the criminal justice system. And so we're only beginning to learn these things, I suppose. And in the end, I really think that what we need to really do is reimagine public safety with those new learnings in mind. And that's not it's not about being critical of individual officers or anything like that, but it's how do we improve this system to make it Schenectady a safer place for everyone, especially for the communities that have been disproportionately affected by the system in its current situation, in its current formation.
Thank you for leading us off, Dustin. Anyone else want to respond to the opening question, which is, how would you describe the current status of the relationship between the police force and the wider community? Oh, I think I see Ann trying to speak. You're still on mute, Ann. Wait,
Woman.
there you go.
And if approached by a police officer, I don't get scared. I do know a few of the police in Schenectady. But if you are a person of color, the fear is there. I work at St. Joseph's Place, so we have a lot of different cultures come into our building, and that's what I see as an issue, is that I don't fear seeing a police officer. Many of the people I hang with are very fearful for many reasons.
Thank you. Yes, and how do we bridge that disconnect of experience and reality, at least in a way that can leave others more empathetic to the challenges and issues? Thank you. Again, I'll float the question a few times, and if I hear just a round of silence, I'll move on to a different question. And again, I think that will allow us to get to more topics and questions this evening. But again, I'll leave that preliminary question out for anyone to respond to. How would you describe the current status of the relationship between Schenectady Police and the wider community?
Father Ray Sopo here from St. Luke's Church and St. Joseph's Church in Schenectady. I agree with both of the previous speakers. My experience has been that of distrust. St. Luke's is in the Central State Street neighborhood, and St. Joseph's is downtown. So both of them have a different type of population and concentration. And my experience has been, perhaps along with fear, is a lack of trust in perhaps the police force in general. I can't say if it's individual officers that people are reacting to, but it is a sense of just not trusting there for safety and for their own good.
Thank you. Anyone else want to respond? Just take yourself off mute and chime in.
Hello, my name is Lois Mitchell, and I'm
Yes,
a
go
member
ahead.
of the Drury Memorial AME Zion Church, and we're on Hamilton Hill, as many of you know, and have been forever and ever and ever. I myself, as a very older woman, I don't have a personal fear of the police, but I have a general feeling of distrust when it comes to the younger men in our community. I just feel that they are almost always approached from the perspective of this could be dangerous. It doesn't even matter if they have on a suit and tie and they just left church. It's an attitude of this could be dangerous. They're not dangerous. They just left church. They're minding their own business, and yet there is a look that they receive that I have observed that says you could be dangerous. So if the approach of the police toward a young African American man, and I'm not talking youngsters, I'm talking 30-year-olds, 35-year-olds, is that this can be dangerous, it's very, very hard for me then to feel trusting. Because even though I'm an older African American woman, what could change that perspective is in the back corner of my mind. So I think there is a feeling of distrust.
Thank you for sharing. Anybody else want to respond to that opening question? Okay, I'll throw another one out, and if you feel compelled to respond, please do so. And again, introduce yourself and the organization you represent briefly before responding. Let's go to the topic of safety. Over the last 12 months, to what extent have your feelings of safety in your community increased, decreased, or stayed the same? Over the past 12 months, to what extent have your feelings of safety in your community increased, decreased, or stayed the same?
Hi, my name is Peter Bernardi, St. Paul the Apostles Church up in Woodlawn. And over the past year or so, I felt that there hasn't been no change in our safety level here in Woodlawn from what I can see.
Thank you. Okay. I also would like to just, I know we're in the preliminary round of questions, but as we move forward in the dialogue, I want to kind of highlight the fact that what you share this evening is going to be included in consideration for potential policy change. So to the best of your abilities as possible, I'd like if you can, yes, speak on current, current and historical kind of realities, but projecting forward to what you would want to see and what would the relationship between the police and community that we aspire to, because those are the elements that are really going to be integral when looking to shift policy and change procedure. So I'd like to, at times dig a little bit deeper with the questions and responses, but we're off to a good start. Anyone else? Over the last 12 months, to what extent have your feelings of safety in your community increased, decreased, or stayed the same?
I'm not good at leading back. I'm gonna try, but Dustin Wright, Clergy Against Hate. One thing I certainly noticed a lot this past summer was the fairly regular sort of folks from different white supremacist groups being inflammatory and instigating issues in a lot of the actions that took place. I'm mindful that, as I understand it, the FBI sort of labels white supremacist groups sort of the top public public threat, and I would love it if our local police were more and worked to be increasingly mindful of that.
Thank you. Yes, is that a hand up, Nicole Harris? Yes, please go ahead, unmute yourself and please go ahead.
Yes, my name is Nicole Harris. I am here as a representative from Schenectady Clergy Against Hate. I'm also the pastor of Doree Memorial AIM Zion Church, which is the oldest African-American church in the city of Schenectady. And so I've been here for a little over a year. So over the last 12 months, I do feel, so because I'm learning the community, so I'm still very much on the outside looking in because I'm so new. And so one of my first things when moving here was, my own safety because I'm moving here, and so as a woman going, okay, is this area safe for me to live and things like that. And one of the members of my church was so very nice to introduce me to one of the local police officers when I got here. And so that was nice. And so I did feel like, okay, this is good, but what really, bothered me. I was riding down State Street one day and I had a meeting to get to, and I did see the police officers handling a young man in a way that made me uncomfortable. And I really contemplated, oh God, I got to get to this meeting, but I really want to turn this car around and make sure that he's okay. And so those kind of things, just kind of watching, and we aren't, as Sister Lois just mentioned, we are on Hewlett. So, we're like right in the heart of the Hamilton Hill section. And so often a lot of young men walk by the church and stuff. And so I am concerned for their safety and well-being, just seeing that. I'm also an active member of the NAACP chapter here in Schenectady. And when the incident happened, with the officer placing his knee on the young man's neck a couple of months ago, I was at that press conference. And soon after that press conference, and this may not be connected, but we're talking about safety over the last 12 months, right? So I went and spoke at that press conference, and not too long after that, our Bible study was attacked. We had our Bible study was attacked by about 15 people came into our online Bible study, calling us, all types of racial slurs and everything. And so I did call the police to make a report. And I reported it to Zoom and did all the things that I had to do. But then the fear is, okay, now we were on Zoom. Would that have happened if we were in the building? And how much more dangerous would that have been if we were actually in the building? So the tension and the climate in the not just in Schenectady, but in the nation right now makes it very makes it for a whole different type of environment for the Black community and the Black church. So do I feel safer right now? Not necessarily, especially with everything that's going on.
Thank you for that. And we certainly want to not only identify problems, but also, like I mentioned, identify potential solutions. So on the topics of trust and safety, from those that we've heard from or from folks that we haven't heard from, what are some things we think can be done to better the trust between the police and the community, or move toward a place where everyone in our community feels more safe when possibly interacting with police? So what can we do to make those issues of trust and safety better?
Not to talk too much, but I have to say this right quick. This is Lois Mitchell again. There used to be a satellite police station on Albany Street near the Sikkim building. And I have to tell you that I felt safer when that police satellite was there. I know they weren't there around the clock, but I think it was even a traffic facility at one time. I don't remember. The point was the presence of the police in our community enhanced the relationship of the people of the community with the officers that were on duty in that station.
Thank you, Lois.
Father Isopo, I think what is important to understand is that trust has to be earned, and it's going to take a while for people to bridge that gap. But I think the essence of that has to be a respect for the individual person, regardless of color, lifestyle, gender. There has to be a basic respect for each individual person. I think that's where trust begins on both sides.
Indeed. Thank you, sir. Okay, go
Hi,
ahead. Yes, please.
my name's Tom Compron. I'm a member of the Unitarian Universalist Society of Schenectady, and I'm a Schenectady resident for the past 15 years. I guess in terms of the question, do I feel safe in Schenectady? I generally feel safe in Schenectady, walking the streets, and around wherever. I don't feel fearful in my neighborhood or downtown. I will echo some of the things other people said, Dustin, Nicole, I think, about the overall environment of our times. Being at a rally or something and seeing white supremacist groups, or just being a member of a liberal faith community. We did have at our church, I believe last year, active shooter training, I think from the Albany Sheriff's Department. So there is sort of this background fear or insecurity that I felt just with those kind of things that have been happening, more so than my personal safety on the street. Hard to say exactly how that ties in with the local police force, but certainly I think if there's that kind of trust in our local department, it gives people a better sense of security. I think also, in terms of the feeling safe, and sort of back to your first question about relationship, if there is a feeling of trust, I think that certainly even as a white person, but maybe a person of color, I'd be more likely to notify the police if I felt a situation was in any way troubling. I saw something, but I think sometimes I have had this feeling, and I've spoken to others too, that you're a little reluctant for fear that the police may overreact in a certain situation. So there's that, you're sort of weighing it. Should I call the police or not? Which is really not I think something we want to have our citizens to be contemplating.
Thank you. Anyone else want to respond to that question before I move on to another?
I'd like to respond to that question.
Yes.
My name is Cece Kane. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm also representing the Unitarian Universalist Society of Schenectady. So I kind of want to hit on your last two questions about my feelings of safety in the community, as well as how we can increase that trust. I have lived in Schenectady the majority of my life now. I'm 19 now. And I moved to Schenectady when I was 7. And I would say that my feeling of safety in the community has neither increased or decreased in that time or in the last 12 months. I grew up the way a lot of children of color grew up, understanding the way that police were going to look at my brother and I, and understanding that sort of calling the police is going to be a last resort because that may not always be the safest option for us. And in terms of how we can increase trust in community so that people do feel more comfortable calling the police, I think that in the last several months, there have been a lot of opportunities for the Schenectady Police Department to do this in terms of complying with the repeal of 50A, addressing and enforcing some of the demands that all of us came up with. I think the community has been telling the police department what policies are harmful and what things we need, and that there has not been a reciprocation that's been felt. So I think it's disappointing in a time where I think there are so many opportunities for change that the Schenectady Police Department has not taken a lot of those opportunities, and I have not personally felt listened to by the community. So I would say that there's no change, and that, you know, that trust needs to be earned by, you know, complying with the repeal of 50A, for example, is a way that the police department can be much more transparent with the community and earn some of that trust.
Thank you for sharing that with us, Cece. I did want to mention, I don't know if everybody on this call was on the previous, but Chief Clifford did give a presentation, and this is available on the YouTube channel where all of these calls are posted. Chief Clifford did give a presentation, and in that presentation, I believe in written form, he responded to some of the demands that all of us previously gave. So I know that's just the beginning of the conversation, and we need to keep extending it. But if you are interested in seeing the initial responses to those demands, it is on the previous video from the first meeting.
Not to interrupt, but if I could just
Please
jump
go
back
ahead.
in
Yes.
momentarily, I actually did read through all of the responses to those demands, and want to say that I was incredibly disappointed at the responses, because I felt like a lot of the responses to the demands were to say, hey, we have this policy that shows that this is actually illegal. For example, with the like hog ties, or we're complying with all the state policies in accordance to this. And that wasn't really the point. The point wasn't to say that what you're doing is illegal. The point is to say that the law is wrong in this scenario, and that you need to change your department policies because the community doesn't feel safe. So I did read through all of those demands, and I didn't really feel like it was so much a response, or that the police department was open to there being any changes. It rather felt like, you know, just pointing to legal policies that showed that they were allowed to do those things, which is obviously not what the community was looking for. So.
Thank you. Thank you for speaking your truth to power. And that's what we're here for tonight, is frank, open, and honest dialogue. So thank you. Anyone else want to speak about how we can improve trust and safety between our police force and our community? Improving trust and safety.
Peter, I'm sorry.
Please go ahead.
All right, Peter Bernardi again. As Father Isopo pointed out, trust begins with respect for each other, both for civilians and the police. And somebody else talked about having police presence in Hamilton Hill. And one of my points is that I always felt that foot patrols were very important. I'm going back years, but foot patrols allows you, both the patrolman and the civilian, to interact with each other and get to know each other. And if you get to know each other, then that brings the tension, but it also raises respect for each other.
Indeed. And I see Christine Palmer's hand. I'm going to come to you 1 second, Christine. I just wanted to kind of piggyback on Peter's statement that we do have a statement in the chat room from Randy Magoo to that point, that one of the folks at Sikkim made the suggestion that Schenectady Police Force attend Sunday services for those that are Christian and observe services on Sundays, and introduce themselves to various members of church communities. So you know, just coming to where the people are and spending time and introducing yourselves. So both Peter and Randy's point, I think, are to the point of having a physical presence, you know, outside of an emergency happening or a situation to respond to. Yes, Christine Palmer, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I did, but the gentleman that spoke before me covered what I was going to say. My name is Christine Palmer. I'm from Bethel AME Church on Mumford Street. I've lived in the city of Schenectady since 1969. And I don't feel safe. I don't go out at night. And I was raised on Hamilton Hill all my life. And community policing is a big, big factor. Because like you said, you get to know the police, they know you. They arrive on the scene with some knowledge of who you are, or who your neighbor is, or what this young man may do, or if he has a drinking problem, or you know if the family's got drugs in there. They're not gonna, and don't come on the scene with an attitude automatically. Because I've seen that. They just come with an attitude because you know they're gonna you've already done something, you're already guilty. And so, well, what's the problem? How can I help? And community policing, I think, would be very, very good for Schenectady.
Thank you.
So Jason, I'd like to say something.
Yes, please.
So my name's Andy Chestnut. I'm an elder at the First Reformed Church, who I'm representing here tonight. And in terms of, I think safety is exactly the right question, because while it's often said the job of the police is to protect citizens, I would argue that actually the job is to help people feel safe. And so, sure, they should minimize and if not prevent harm from coming to people in their property, but often the activities that they can undertake to do that wind up to increase fear and feelings of insecurity among the people or particular racial subgroups. So I think that that really, rather than thinking that police power is something that comes from the police station and is projected outwards to do this or that in the community, it's actually the community's power itself that the police are using. So the power comes from the community. It authorizes the city to do things, but really the measure of how successful the public safety effort is, I don't think is measured by statistics. It's measured by how people feel. And so if what we do that we think is going to do what we think policing is, but people don't feel safe. So that's why I would agree with the speaker who said it doesn't matter whether what matters is not whether we have the power to do it, but whether it's the right thing to do. And I think that many times the police forces act in such a way as to keep themselves safe, right? So as long as they're in cars, as long as they're with helmets, as long as they have body armor, as long as they're heavily armed, that helps keep them safe, but it freaks everybody else out. So I think that, and that as a psychotherapist in daily life, the idea of the hormones, the chemicals, the stress hormones going through people's bodies, that makes it harder for them to hear, makes them harder for them to reason. And whether that's a policeman who's afraid, or whether that's a person on the street who's afraid, or, and since I also sit on the school board, whether it's a child who's afraid, that is really difficult to learn. So this idea of helping people feel calm, keeping their heart rates down, keeping the, and that allows the resources to go back to people's heads so they can talk and converse and have feel like they're being heard. And the kind of stress that leads from interactions really needs to be minimized, and the people that are on salary being paid by the citizens to do it, I think have an extra responsibility to make sure that they reduce the tension level and the stress level of interactions.
Thank you, Andy. Okay, I'd like to go to the topic of procedural justice.
Can I make a statement, please?
Absolutely.
Hi, I'm Frank RANUCCI. I'm with St. Anthony's Church in Schenectady. And I'd like to speak to the trust issue. And it's important for citizens to feel that they can trust the police department. But it seems like now there are two sides, us against them and them against us. I think what we need to do is better bring the two sides together. And then the question becomes, how do you do that? Well, I have a few ideas. A great way to connect officers to the community could be for the department to commit to collectively contribute 100 hours a month, or pick a number, doesn't matter, of community service each month. It sounds like a lot, but if it's broken down, it comes to about an hour or two for each member of the department. Here's some great ways to accomplish that, and and be involved in the community as a resource, and seen as a resource rather than maybe the us or them thing. Meet your constituents. How do you do that? By going to volunteer for food service at the City Mission or Salvation Army. Serving the afternoon or evening meal. It takes about an hour and a half or so. I've done it myself. Not a bad thing to do. The Sikkim Food Pantry, they can sort and distribute donated food and give it to needy families. You'll see a lot of people that you see when you're on your shift. The home furnishing program is another great program. They're in need of volunteers to drive their truck to make deliveries and donated furniture to the needy families in Schenectady. There's many officers that have children that play in organized sports, be a volunteer or as a coach. Big Brothers and Big Sisters program, maybe this could be something to strike up some relationships with the younger people. They could partner with a not-for-profit. The agency could partner with a not-for-profit agency on a particular project. Numerous other ways to connect to the community would be to serve on a board of director, have certain officers volunteer to be board members at the Boys and Girls Club, the Salvation Army, the City Mission, Northeast Parent and Child, United Way, SICM, the County Youth Board, and the list goes on. So I think if you want to start someplace that's fairly easy to do, put some people together and think of a way to have officers volunteer their time at one of the public agencies that serve our community in total.
Thank you for those suggestions, Frank. And I'm hearing a trend in having police interact with the community a little bit more outside of responding to a situation or an incident, just regular everyday kind of interactions and expanding that both in amount of hours, but also in the different types of events and different sectors of the community that they interact with. Certainly seems to be a trend as far as recommendations. Okay, speaking on the topic of procedural justice, from your perspective, to what extent do police officers treat people in your community fairly? To what extent do police officers treat people in your community fairly?
My name is Molane Gilmore, and I'm from Refreshing Spring Church. And Anne for what she does in our community, because most of us who live in our community would not do what those ladies do at St. Joseph's. But I'm going back to what Mr. Frank just said. Yes, the police need to be much more involved, but even prior to that, the police need to live in the city limits. Because if you're my neighbor, you have a tendency to know me and treat me better or differently because you know me. Just as if, I would say Jason, Mr. Jason, he would never do that. And it would be Jason and Molane. And that's how we have to get to. Because feeling safe, like Miss Christine was saying, those of us who are older, no, we don't. And the police, Miss Lois, don't think no more of us as older people than they do the younger people. I was telling a young man not to resist the police, just be still and let them take you in. Do you know that police officer cussed me to no not one? All right? So, we need to do this thing again because it's not good. It really, really is not good. And most of these police officers are young enough to be our children. And that's really bad when you have to be insulted and berated by somebody who's young enough to be your child or even grandchild in some instances. It's not good. And the police chief is a good person. He listens. However, he's not the only one out there. Some of them young people are not nice. I was accused of stealing something in a store when I was out front sweeping. What? This is the stuff that goes on. No, we don't feel safe here. No. And that's the first way we need young people from our community, the Schenectady community as a whole, to do something, because this has to change. The change has to come from within. And Mr. Jason, I too came from New York City. I went to school 50 years ago. But at any rate, I digress from that. But the truth is that we need to do this thing together. That's the only way.
Thank you, Melaine, for speaking your truth and for sharing. I appreciate your voice this evening. Anyone else want to answer, to what extent do you feel police in your community treat members of your community fairly? Okay, I can move on to another question and hopefully something will elicit a response here. Let's talk about performance. Moving on to a different topic. In your opinion, how effective is the Schenectady police force at proactively preventing crime? In your opinion, how effective is the Schenectady police force at proactively preventing crime? Yes, Ms. Palmer.
Yes, this is just my opinion from what I observed an incident the other day on Eagle Street. I was visiting there, and there were two young boys, maybe about 7 or 8 years old, riding on little dirt bikes that are not street legal. And one of them had a helmet, one didn't. Why their parents let them on them, I don't know. But a police came down the street. I said, well, maybe he's going to stop and do something. If nothing else, confiscate them because they're illegal. He just rode right on by him, and I watched, and I said, well, maybe he's going to stop. He didn't, and I said, well, maybe he's on a call. He'll send somebody else back. I sat there for a couple hours, and nobody never came, and they ran up and down that street, I don't know how many times, going out to the end of State Street, turning around. And I just sat there, and I said, what are you going to do? What can you do? And this is all day, every day. I go visit over there often. And it's not just the children, there are grown-ups. And the police presence over there is all the time, but they do nothing. They see stuff going on over there, and they do absolutely nothing. There's drug house after drug house, drug addicts after drug addicts on the corner. The one house on the corner of State and Eagle, I don't know how those people live there. They camp out on their lawn, they lay down, they shoot drugs on the step. And I'm not saying what somebody told me, I'm saying what I've seen with my own eyes. They shoot, they smoke, they do everything right on that corner. And I know that there must be cameras there. So somebody must be seeing this other than me and the people that live over there. It's very sad. I wish those were my parents that lived in that house, because they wouldn't be sitting there, I bet you that.
Thank you, Ms. Palmer. Anyone else on the call tonight want to answer that question? In your opinion, sorry, I'm losing my spot here. From your perspective, to what extent do police officers treat people in your community fairly? Okay.
Jason?
Yes, please.
I think it's a related comment that I'm going to make. Not too long ago, there was a recent incident at our parish. Again, this is Frank RANUCCI, St. Anthony's Church, so sorry about that. A recent incident at our parish relative to an individual causing a huge disruption of our services, and which required us to call for assistance to the Schenectady Police Department. And I must say there's a long history that led up to that particular incident with this individual. Two officers arrived and spoke to the individual at length, and they showed great patience, compassion, and understanding. They offered many suggestions for that individual to seek help, including bringing them to the Ellis Mental Health Clinic. They additionally called a family member who spoke to the person and to the police officer as well. And they provided the officer some additional information and background for the individual. The officers wound up transporting the person home. And I think that they displayed great concern and were very knowledgeable of what agencies could provide the help. And they explained all that they were doing to me prior to them leaving and taking the individual home. I think there are many individual cases like that, and they don't get talked about enough. The Schenectady Police Department, I think, has been very responsive to the needs of our community. There's always room to be better at it. But I just wanted to mention that one particular case where they did an outstanding job. They comforted the woman, got her calmed down. She was very upset, and I was impressed.
Thank you for sharing that, Frank. Somebody else, I have a related question based off of Frank's response, but I do want to allow a moment if anybody wants to respond to that previous question. Okay. You mentioned a situation where mental health services were needed, and I have a question here. Police officers are often called to address issues where, in an ideal situation, another agency or resource in the community could have at times prevented or at minimum assisted in bettering the outcome. What would you offer this evening as to ways that we can expand the conversation around the issues facing our communities beyond simply the role that police play? Again, expanding the conversation beyond the role that police play, because often, as with Frank's recent description, there are other issues where other resources and other agencies can be involved. How can we expand the conversation to include a conversation outside of the role that police play? Yes, Vivette, thank you.
Hi, so I think one of the challenges, and this is, I'm sorry, I'm from Christchurch in Schenectady. I'm also a nurse, and I think it's a big challenge in terms of mental health and resources. And I think the police, they're in a hot spot because they're calling to sometimes these emergent situations to kind of like de-escalate something. And it's a bigger problem. It's a bigger problem of resources for these issues. And I think it comes at a much bigger level than even Schenectady. It's much more from the state. It's what's available to people. It's what available for people with mental health issues to have resources. And they're very, very limited in Schenectady. And people trying to get to like a counselor or whatever it is, they're on long wait lists, or they can't get an appointment, or maybe they're not really able to go to appointments and whatever, and there are not enough support systems in place to help. So I think it's a complex problem, and I give the police credit that sometimes they're the ones that respond and have to alleviate something when it's really at a crisis point. But it's really a bigger issue of resources that are made available for the citizens, and an awareness of all these things. It comes from the education system, like our kids taught enough how to cope, and then they're not, and then they grow up to be adults and they grow up with all these struggles. So it's very, very complex, and I don't think there's an easy answer.
Thank you for that, and thank you for your service as a nurse. And we certainly, again, these conversations are being recorded for the record, and I think folks will also have a chance, if you'd like to respond in written form to the whole slew of questions that were sent out in the agenda. But yes, I think that it's going to be important to make sure that in the report that we include, some type of suggestions about other types of agencies and resources and services that can work in conjunction with our police.
Jason?
Yes, please, jump right in.
Tom again from the Unitarian Universalist Church. I don't have the easy answer to that either, like Vivette said. I will share that we did have a meeting with several members of our congregation after the service on Sunday, and this was a topic that came up quite often. A lot of people spoke and voiced hopes or thoughts that we would better respond to emergencies if something could happen when we called 911, other than the fire or police departments responding. If somebody could be with them, or if there were some other resources that could be engaged for a lot of kinds of things that we do call the police for. And, you know, ultimately, maybe that's when we talk about our resources as a city and as a county and as a state. That's something we will think about as to how we might better allocate resources to meet that, and not ask the police to do things that, you know, ultimately are not, they're not best trained for it. There are other people who could respond better and help more. So yeah, I think that was a point that a lot of members of our congregation brought up.
Thank you for that. Go ahead, please. Somebody, Dustin, did you want to jump in?
Sure, yeah, just, I mean, real quick, just to, kind of second a lot of what's being talked about. This is a great example of where our current policing system is antiquated and making it more difficult for everyone involved. It's putting police officers in situations they're not equipped for, and it's leading to more dangerous situations for people in mental health crises or in addiction issues or homelessness. Why we can only get a firefighter or a police officer or on scene with a phone call right away. I've had parishioners in my congregation trying to get mental health assistance for months, and I know that's something beyond the police department, but I think we need to move from thinking just about policing, just as Andy I think said earlier, to public safety. And there's a whole lot of more tools that we are not employing that should be part of that public safety system.
Yes, this is an important part of the conversation about, a more robust and well-rounded, and the, COVID and the isolation that COVID can bring has certainly exacerbated, already existing mental health concerns in our community. So that certainly needs to be part of the conversation. We did have a question in the chat room, and I don't know if the chief can respond to this, if it's readily available data, but Nicole Harris asked, would we be able to know what percentage currently of the officers reside within the city limits of Schenectady?
I
can do that, but.
Yeah, we don't have that information readily available. If we were to guess right now, we're thinking 10 to 15%.
Okay, thank you, Chief. Right. We have another question in the chat room. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Somebody wanted to jump in.
I wanted to respond to the mental health stuff. That's what I do.
Yes, please.
And I think that this actually connects. I was talking about the body chemistry before, about how when we feel, actually our default position as human beings is to be vigilant. And so we actually have to feel safe somehow before our brain will send the signals to the rest of our bodies to, sorry, calm down, you're safe now, you can have a conversation, you don't have to, have the fight or flight going on. But the reality is that in the mental health situation, let's say during COVID, is that those relationships, it's very difficult to establish them when the system is stressed, when everybody's stressed, right? That's why the relationships kind of have to need to be built beforehand, right? Think of Schenectady Interfaith. It's been going on for decades, and people know each other from different faiths. So therefore, if there's a crisis that comes up, it's comfortable to talk to people that we already know. And I think that needs to be true for people's therapists, but it also needs to be, I think, from the public safety perspective, if the only time we see police is when there's a crisis, then how are we going to get comfortable with them? How are we going to have that relaxed feeling of safety if the only time, because those relationships need to be built. They don't build themselves. And if we want them when there's a crisis, then we need to build them in safety. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Melaine, and then I'll go to the question in the chat room.
Okay, now, since Mr. Andy said what he said, in order to move forward, let's move forward. How come we can't have a task force headed up by people who are aware of mental health? And now Mr. Andy just talked about the chemical imbalances that take place. Now, who would think about that? nobody but people who are in that field. So I think that we all need to be brought under that tent to move forward. There's such a wealth of knowledge on this call here. It seems like we need to not be here again in the next 3 months. There's too many smart people here not to move us forward. And tell me this 10%. Is 10% of what? Is 10% live in the community or 10% what? In terms of police, I gotta understand, I'm an older person. You can't, you gotta explain specifically. 10% of what?
Chief, did you, go ahead, sir. Chief, do you want to reply to that?
Well, currently, Mullane, we have about 150 police officers right now, sworn officers. It's fair to say that all of our civilian employees do live in the city. But of the 150 police officers, our guess is that 15 to 20 of them live in the city limits.
Thank you, Chief. And while I have you on the line, let me go to the question in the chat room. To what extent does the Schenectady Police Force have access to crisis management services when you are potentially called to a mental health situation?
I'm going to turn that one over to Lieutenant Mascherone, something that he's been working on.
We do have access. We work with Northern Rivers, which used to be the former Parsons. So we do have access. One of the challenges, I think, inevitably in policing, and one of the things that I've heard on the call that I think is something that we have to work on, is we have access. So if we have time on our side, we can get somebody there to deal with a crisis situation. One of the challenges is the crisis is evolving so quickly that the police will obviously be arriving prior to, help coming. And I heard Vivette talk about some of the resource challenges. Certainly Northern Rivers is an amazing partner of ours, but they're a pretty small group who covers the capital region. So to be able to get them to come out, we definitely need, or as we look forward in these conversations, as we look forward in evolving policing, we need to make that a huge component of this, is expanding these resources so we can get them there in the moment of crisis. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the officer making the initial contact with the person.
Thank you for that insight, Lieutenant. Yes, Nicole. I think you're on mute. I cannot. Still can't pick up any audio. We'll certainly come back to you. Just chime in and we'll let you know when we can hear you.
I would also like to speak to the question about how we can expand policing. I think that, on two fronts, it's important to look at resources that can be provided outside of how we think of policing in the U.S. I think that both when police are actually responding to emergency situations, not only can it keep civilians safer, but it can keep our officers safer as well. If there are mental health professionals, people like social workers and psychologists responding to those situations, either alone or in conjunction with police, I think that it's impossible for us to expect people with a police training to be able to adequately respond to those situations alone, and to be able to de-escalate those situations. And I also think that, when we hear activists call for things like defund the police, they're calling for things like allocating that funding to education, to mental health resources, to parks and recreation, so that people have safe spaces to hang out in. And I think that on a preventative level as well, that looking at how we can fund and allocate more resources at a city level to other programs can help prevent crime and also make our communities a safer space.
Thank you for those suggestions. No, we can't. Nicole, I see you trying to jump in, and we had you on audio for the first question, but for some reason we're not picking you up now. Sometimes if you X out and then reconnect to the call, that helps it at times. But we'll make sure that if you get your audio back on, that we come to you for a question. Okay, I'd like to move back to the issues of trust. Again, I'm jumping around just in an effort to get to as many questions as possible. from your perspective, to what extent does your police force make it easy for you to provide input from the members of the community to the police department? Comments or concern? Again, from your perspective, to what extent does your police force make it easy for members of the community to provide input to them?
My experience of this past summer was of a lot of folks not being heard. I don't know if I cut out.
No, we hear you, Dustin.
Everything started getting weird. Everyone's faces disappeared. Anyway, you know, I think I was standing right there and so happy when Chief Clifford took that step of taking a knee early on this summer, and I think we were a model for the nation in some ways in that initial step. And I just deeply wish that folks, that officers and whatever and leaders could have come out to hear just the pain and the anger of of what our activists were lifting up this past summer. I think that could have been an incredible way of starting to build trust, just like that first day did, and being fully mindful that 400 years of racism make people angry, and that's not about the individual officers. That you might be hearing things that are obviously hard to hear, and I get that, right? As a pastor, sometimes people are angry at the church, but they seem like they're angry at me too. And I get that, but I just really wish that there could have been more. Folks were keeping things nonviolent this summer. They were self-policing, and I think because of that, it would have been a really big trust-building thing if both our elected leaders as well as our police leaders would have been willing to come out and not endorse everything being said. I totally get that, but to be there and say, I'm here to listen. And I hope in future actions, because I doubt that the political climate's going to get super mellow in a few days' time, no matter what. In situations, I guess I would hope that our police leaders and our elected leaders
I think we lost that last bit of audio, Dustin, but I think we got the main gist of that, and thank you. So the current question is, to what extent do you feel the police force makes it easy to provide feedback to them, whether it's a question, comment, or concern? Yes, Mr. Magoo.
Yeah, so I was going to say, over the years, I can honestly and truly say that I've had a really good, working relationship with the Schenectady Police Department. I've had good interactions with the chief and many of his staff, Lieutenant Matrone and Nick Mannix, Sergeant Mannix. But I see it more. I think the reason I have such good relationship with the folks is the fact that I am older. I don't pose as much of a threat anymore because I'm an old guy. So therefore, I don't, and I see things more from, because I was a bureaucrat most of my career, so I see things more from a bureaucratic perspective. But for somebody who's younger and doesn't have the same, tools and skills that I've developed over the course of my life, it's a different ball game because, I'm not going to say I've learned to temper my anger, but I've learned to redirect it in a more positive way so that when I stress a point, it doesn't come across as if I'm attacking someone. But our younger folks don't have that same skill set. So when they do present to an officer or to someone at a higher level in the police department, it does come across as being, they're angry. And I think officers need to understand that, there's a lot of folks out there who need, maybe need to be a little bit more patient, more understanding with these younger folks because, they don't have the same skill set as some of us older, more skilled individuals. So I guess that's what, I want to say. But like I said, I've yet to say that I had any bad interactions with the chief and his staff, because, you know, most of the things that we've worked together on, I think has been a really good collaborative situation.
Thank you, Mr. Magoo. I see a question in the chat room, but and we'll come right back to that. But Mr. Magoo, I think you touched on the issue of bias a little bit in the way folks are perceived. So your perception versus maybe how the perception of a younger individual might enter a situation. So I do want to throw that question I have at the bottom about bias, and it reads: we all have biases. To be biased is to be human. Bias in and of itself is not a negative thing. Our challenge is twofold. One, how aware are we of our particular biases that we hold? And then two, to what extent are our implicit biases controlling our overt behaviors and decisions and actions? So I'd like to ask, you know, when often police officers are asked to respond or address an incident where they are asked to make very quick judgments and respond accordingly. And this means at times that officers are asked to walk that kind of tight line between the possible reality of a given situation, like a hunch that they might feel or a gut feeling, and any biases that they may hold. So how can we have a robust conversation that both holds police officers accountable for inaccurate biases that they may hold, and often life-altering outcomes that can occur, while also highlighting the utility of being able to rely on instinct and gut feeling? So I know that's a lot, but basically I'm just trying to point to that bias enters every human interaction, and police officers are often tasked with the gut feeling that they might be having, however incorrect that may be or off it may be, or sometimes accurate, versus, you know, the reality, and then have that mix kind of enter a situation where they're asked to respond quickly. So does somebody want to speak to that? How can we kind of move forward in a way that acknowledges those situations that police officers are often in, but also continues to hold officers accountable when their implicit biases may affect the situation in a negative way?
So this is Andy Chestnut from First Reformed Church.
Yes.
And, so this is a kind of a squishy question, and I'm going to suggest that one of the ways to get a handle on it would be to actually to look at data. And so, for instance, what's the racial breakdown of tickets written by the SPD? So what percentage of the city, what are the ethnicities percent-wise in the city? And how does that relate to the traffic tickets? How about arrests? How about the inmates in the jail? How about the time when force is used, right? How about the breakdown by race of the defendants prosecuted, or the juries, right? So if we look and we say if a certain ethnic group is their percent likelihood of being pulled over in a traffic stop is the same as that of the total population in Schenectady, then that would be a way to say, well, it doesn't look like, you know, these implicit biases and so on is affecting things so much. But if we find that blacks, for instance, are pulled over twice as often as average, then that would clearly be an indication. I mean, there's actually, for hundreds of years, there's been an assumption that black people are violent and criminals. So therefore, and that's the racist position. The anti-racist position says that no, this isn't determined by skin color, it's determined by individual behaviors, which on average should pretty much be average. So if we were able actually to look at the data about that, those various things, and I'm sure there's ones I've forgotten, that would give us a sense about where there are disproportionalities and where there's disparate impact.
Yes, thank you for bringing up those points, Andy. And, you know, I do want to remind folks that the Finn Institute is a research institute that is participating in these calls and are combing through the data. But data is certainly an important aspect of this process. And yes, if we are humans and we have bias, then inevitably bias is going to enter into systems. And we talk about procedural bias or process bias. That can, you know, when you look at a large scope of data, you can kind of point to some trends. So So thank you for pointing out the importance of looking at that data. And I hope that, you know, this report and the findings kind of stress the importance of using data as a guide to inform policy and procedural change. Go ahead.
Because it also connects to some previous comments. Statistics show that people recognize it's easier for them to identify people of their own racial group as opposed to other racial groups. And it's also easier to recognize people if they're your neighbors. So this idea of the degree to which the ethnic breakdown of our police force is closer to or further away from that of our population, and the degree to which people actually live in the city is also going to affect those implicit biases, because the more we know each other as individuals, the less we're going to react on instinct.
Thank you. Nicole, let's see if we can get your audio back on, and then Cece, I know you have a question in the chat room. We'll come to that right next. Nicole,
Okay,
can we hear you? Yes, we can hear you.
okay. I had to log in from my phone. I was like, trying to get back in. But I think so. It sounds like you guys were kind of already discussing it, but so I wanted to talk about the cultural piece of it, because we were talking about the mental health piece, and I do know that there are certain trainings that can be offered to our officers in regards to mental health. I was interested in what was offered as far as cultural sensitivity. So like I said, I'm new to Schenectady. I've been here for a year as a pastor, but part of the reason why I think my bishop sent me here is because I am from a Hamilton Hill type section of New Jersey. So I understand the culture. So I came into what I was familiar with. So what seems scary to one person, if somebody is familiar with the culture, is not scary to them. I pastor a Black church. I'm telling you right now, some of the stuff that's going on in my church, if you are not familiar with Black church, you're gonna be like, what is going on up in here? Okay. But if you're familiar with Black church, you are okay. So, and the same thing happens in our community. Sometimes what one perceives as a disturbance is really just somebody, being themselves, having fun at a barbecue. And they're saying, oh, you're causing a disturbance. It's like, not really, but if you know the culture, then you know that. So with our police department, with it only being, maybe 10 to 20% from within the city limits, then that question popped in my head of, okay, are they familiar with the culture? Because it is a dangerous thing not to be familiar with the culture altogether. And I think it is even a more dangerous thing to only be familiar with culture by what you see on media. So if what you saw on news or on a movie is the only time you've ever seen a Black person, you are probably wrong. I'm just being, it's same for me. It's the only time I've seen a white person, Spanish person, whoever it was on television, then my perception is completely off. And sometimes if you have, and I'm not saying that this is necessarily what's happening in Schenectady Police Department, but if you have officers in your department that really are not familiar with any Black people, any Guyanese people, any Spanish people outside of their work environment, that is problematic.
Thank you for that. Yes, that is exposure is so important. We arguably live in more segregated times now than in the 50s and 60s, and often folks can go throughout a day with a very homogeneous set of interactions. And so that exposure, like you pointed out, not only in a situation or a crisis moment, but and hopefully our empathy to the challenges facing those from another culture or group. So that came up on a previous call that we had in the first round, and I think it's coming up again, the importance of more cross-cultural exchange, more cross-cultural dialogue, more cross-cultural time spent together. So again, coming back to the question in the chat room, and maybe this is a question for the chief or someone in the department there, but could someone briefly explain the complaint process and how those complaints are handled internally or externally? Again, I believe we have a few minutes to kind of make this more of a response. So Chief, did you have a quick response to that, or can someone quickly just chime in on how complaint process works and how they're handled?
Sure, I can. Briefly, we will handle a complaint in any form, whether it's verbal or written. We do have complaint forms that can be picked up here at the police department, or they can be downloaded off of our website. If a complaint comes in, it all depends on the severity of it. If it's an official complaint, it typically goes immediately to our Office of Professional Standards. They will review it. If it's a verbal complaint, it may go directly to the platoon commander, the lieutenant in charge of the shift. They will determine if it can be handled at their level or if it should go to our Office of Professional Standards. Should it get to either level that it's at, it's going to be looked at in the same manner, which will be investigated. That investigation culminates in a report that is then forwarded to myself for review. And the report will typically look like what members of our Civilian Police Review Board typically see, which is a breakdown of the accusation, the investigation, the sources used to investigate the incident, and then the findings. And then there's also ancillary issues. So when we look at an incident, we'll look at the complaint itself, but we'll also look at see what else we find during that investigation. So that's the complaint process. Once it's forwarded to me, I sign off on it. I send it back to the assistant chief of whatever bureau the person comes from, and they will determine if it is a sustained complaint. That means that there was something that was done that was wrong. They will determine if there's discipline. Discipline can be in many forms. It can be a verbal counseling all the way up to official discipline charges where it has the potential to be suspension and or up to termination. At that point, if it's a citizen initiated complaint, it then gets put into the pile that will then be forwarded to the Civilian Police Review Board for their oversight and review.
Thank you, Chief, for that, walking us through that process.
Does the person who makes the complaint ever get a response?
Yes, I apologize for leaving that out. Once I sign off on it, we do write a letter to the person that who made the complaint, and we also follow up with a letter to the officers involved, letting them know the outcomes.
The policy is listed too. The policy is also posted on the city website for anybody to review if they wish.
Thank you. Okay, we're coming up on about 30 minutes left. And I'd like us to really hone in on solutions, potential policy changes, tangible, actionable things that this task force can actually use to change policy and procedure. So with that, go ahead, please. Somebody's jumping in. Yes.
I was going to, Jason, this is Tom again from the Unitarian Universalist Church.
Yes.
Just sort of in response to your last question about the implicit bias, I would just share that, in our church, we've made efforts to grapple with our own biases and our own racist beliefs and behaviors. And we see from our own experience, and certainly from a lot of scholarship that's come out in the last 20 years, but certainly the last 10 years, how challenging it is to understand those biases in ourselves and the ones that permeate through the culture. And we've certainly learned that there's no simple fix for it now, and that these things are not going to be overcome, certainly not in my lifetime. And that we shouldn't ever have the idea that I can take a course, a single sensitivity course or bias training course, and that's going to enable me for the rest of my working days as a police officer, for instance, or as a minister, or as a grocery clerk, whatever it is. We see that even if I could gain that perfection today, if I took that sensitivity course, if I eliminate all of my biases, the truth is that racism is active still today. People benefit from it. People use it to get higher ratings on TV. Some people use it to fill the pews in their church. Some people use it to get votes. And the truth is, even if I eliminated all my biases today, when I get up tomorrow morning, somebody's going to be telling new racist lies. They're going to be trading on these 100-year-old myths about Black people being dangerous. And we need to understand that as members of the community, as people of faith, as police officers, we are in a special position, and we need to understand that each day we're going to have to get up and find ways to address these things, find ways to look at ourselves, at our workmates, and share with each other our experience, say, what biases are creeping in now? How are we going to continue to monitor and overcome these. It's never going to be sort of simple thing that we take a week-long workshop or something and dispel all of these things. So I just wanted to bring that up, for that, the challenges of it.
Thank you for that, Tom. And I think it kind of goes back to some of Reverend Nicole's statements that we have to sometimes question the messages that we've been fed about other groups that are different from our own. Do you have a well-rounded, well-grounded perception of other groups? You know, a colleague, a trusted kind of a colleague, you know, said to me, and I included it in my opening statement, which I didn't read in full tonight, but you know, they only know what they know about people because they're willing to have conversations with diverse people. So they're basing what they know about a certain community based off of actual interactions and getting to know. I think, you know, one way to kind of at least begin to tackle our biases, and I agree that we may never be able to tackle them fully, but begin to tackle them is to be willing to expose ourselves to the other, whatever the other is for you on this call, and to do it consistently and in a way where there's a reciprocal kind of exchange and learning. So thank you for that. Again, I wanted to kind of make sure the last 30 minutes that we're really focusing on tangible, actionable recommendations for the task force. So please, I encourage in your responses to really focus on we've uncovered many of the issues, we've uncovered many of the challenges. Let's commit in these last 25 minutes or so to try to focus on more solutions in our responses. So going back to trust, and we talked a little bit about this at the beginning, but maybe hearing a few more comments. In your opinion, what can be done to strengthen the trust between the police force and the wider community?
For me, there are 4 gentlemen sitting there from the police department that I know fairly well, and they know that if I have something to say, I'm going to say it to their face and not behind their back. And people only know what you show, and it's important for us to come together, person to person, to get to know each other. And I can say that those 4 gentlemen there, they know my name and I know theirs.
Thank you, Melaine. And that's certainly the importance of that one-on-one connection. Let's also think a little bit larger, more systemically. What types of procedures can be in place that can help build trust, or at least continue to try to start to repair it? Yes, Cecilia.
Yeah, I want to thank you all for answering the question about how complaints are handled. And I think one thing that can build trust in communities is to have an independent body investigating complaints. I think it's really hard for any institution, members of any institution, to be held accountable by other members of that institution. And so to have an internal investigative mechanism isn't always the most efficient thing and doesn't always instill trust in the community. So to make those investigations of complaints external and to have another person or board to be accountable to is one thing I think can help to build that trust back.
Thank you.
And certainly transparency is always important in trust. I think in any organization, certainly between the community and the bureaucracy, and certainly the police, and transparency in terms of disciplinary records, other things like that, where we just feel like we're on the same team in a sense. That, again, like people spoke earlier about the feeling of safety in the community and just feeling like a community. And that kind of transparency, we feel that if there's been an issue that everyone is invested in finding out the truth of that situation or that issue. The community, the community active groups, the churches, and the police force.
Yes.
Jason?
Thank you. Yes, Felicia, did you have a comment? Oh, I'm sorry. I thought it. Did I end up?
I just want to ask a real quick question, because we were talking about the sort of backtracking to the mental health piece. Not only, but we were talking about the mental health issues within the community itself, but I was thinking about the mental health issues within the police department. And the reason I'm bringing that up is even when, because years ago I worked in the New York State Department of Correctional Services, and I had the opportunity to serve as coordinator for the psychological exam for candidates who were applying who had taken the test and applied for the, to be a correction officer. And they give them a battery of tests to determine whether they are psychologically fit to be correction officers. But when we think about implicit bias, and you have somebody who has been trained in implicit bias, but in stressful situations, they may revert back to their old behavior based on the fact that they're, I mean, and I don't know how you address that in the psychological, because I know the police officers have to go through a psychological exam to determine whether they're fit to be police officers. So how do you address that in a situation that even though somebody has been exposed to implicit bias training, but they're put into a situation where it's a crisis situation, is and acting on a moment's notice based on the situation, that their old behaviors don't come back into the situation that they're currently in. Did that make sense?
It did. The stress of the situation kind of sometimes takes precedent in the moment versus some training that might have been received.
Right.
Yeah, the second that, I mean, I think I know Dustin again. A lot of there's a lot that I think police could learn from our military in terms of kind of more normalizing conversation around mental health within the force. So I really want to second that. I had a couple other comments about trust as well. Number one, I'd love to hear the number of complaints that were received last year, just to see, how regularly people are trusting that process. I think that's a helpful thing. Another thing too that we've talked a lot about bias around race. And that's a key thing. But right, I'm still learning too, right, as we are fully kind of discovering what it means to be folks across an entire spectrum of gender identity. And I've definitely witnessed some things in some conversations that there has to be a lot of education there as well for our police and other public safety officials. There's a lot more I need to do too. It's not, we're learning, that's a journey, but I think that's another really important thing as well. And I think the last thing I'd say in terms of building trust is if the police made a very public commitment to, on a regular, monthly, every 2 months basis, meet with the NAACP, meet with all of us, meet with our civil rights organizations on a regular basis to talk about concerns. I think that would be a huge step in the right direction in terms of building trust.
Thank you for those tangible suggestions, Dustin. Anyone else? We're moving. We got about 20 minutes and we really want to focus on solutions. What can be done to start to rebuild trust? Is that a hand up, Felicia?
Yes, it is.
Great to see you this evening. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much. I think one of the things that we need to work on is continued workshops to develop trust. I think if it's a one-shot deal only, it's not going to work. As we know, the world is ever changing, and we need to be able to be on top of things, not just our police officers, but also our folks in the community. As we're educated as to what our rights are and also how to make sure that our rights are not violated, I think that's going to assist everybody. Mental health certainly is a big issue. I think the fact is that, number one, we're beginning to talk more and more about mental health and trying to find solutions. And I think the solution is in the community. And it really starts with us trying to learn to work together. I think sometimes we, even as citizens in the community, depending on what our experience has been with the police, it may then put forth negative roadblocks. If we've had some positive experience, it may make us communicate a little bit more. And I think communication is a key to us being able to move forward and also to be able to develop some healthy relationships and for us to be able to model it in our communities to help our youth.
Thank you.
So
Hi,
Jason, go ahead.
hi. So this is Rachel Curtis. I'm representing Schenectady Community Ministries tonight. I'm also a school social worker, and I've worked in human services in the city of Schenectady for 15 years. I do think that, as I stated this last week, that anti-racist education is really key. And along with some other comments earlier, genuine community involvement is really important. And I say this because I believe, you know, as a white officer or as any white person really, if you don't have any experience with people of color, then you're going to be operating off of really inaccurate and detrimental stereotypes, specifically of Black males. And so out of fear, you know, there's unnecessary force used. But that being said, I really believe Schenectady is in a good position to make meaningful changes. And as a possible model for the country, I think our city has come a long way in many ways, and this is something that would just make sense to fix.
Thank you for those comments, Rachel. Somebody else was jumping in. Yes,
I was trying
please.
to jump in, Jason. So people talked about efficiency, and that's there's nothing wrong with efficiency, but it is true that sometimes it seems like the public safety operates in such a way as to maintain its own efficiency as opposed to provide more public safety. So for instance, with the central police station sort of acting like the bat cave, and like things go out from there and then they come back from there. And it struck me that if the public safety presence was actually broken up into smaller pieces that were distributed through the city, and not necessarily entirely police, but it could also have mental health or some, you know, some other kinds of elements to it, but that there was, you know, a public safety office in various neighborhoods where people could actually get to know each other, where there could be, you know, a barbecue every now and then, or, you know, the kind of thing to where we look at public safety as not something that radiates outwards from central thing, but that actually organically exists in various places throughout the city. And it might not be the most efficient, but it might be a lot more effective at actually providing people with a feeling of safety.
Yes, thank you.
I have to say this, that we tried to get a police substation at 400 Craig Street. That was the reason why we as a community signed on with TCD for the property, was the fact that in the old Sacred Heart St. Columbus school was to be a police substation. Well, what happened? We all jumped on the bandwagon, and it just didn't happen. We have a very nice young man there, the Sergeant Mark Jerome, but that's not how it was supposed to be. So somehow, when we request what Mr. Andy was just talking about, that was on the table for 400. And somehow we went through our fingers just like sand. So that has to be shored up. That was a promise, not on the part of the police department per se, but on the part of the community builders it was. So that's that part. The other thing is, I want to know what the union has to do with regards to these changes, because we can talk all day long, but that union is a very powerful force. And if they're not on board, the Police Benevolent Association, that is a very powerful arm in terms of the union. And if they're not on board with it, well, everybody in the room can say what they want to say. But I want to know about the union. Are they on board with these changes?
Raised some good points, Melaine. Thank you. Okay, we just got about 14 minutes left, and I'm just going to have a simple question out there. How would you improve the Schenectady Police Department? like to try to encourage those we may not have heard from this evening to try to lean in and to the conversation. How would you improve the current Schenectady Police Department?
Justice Jason?
Yes, please.
I think we've talked about that since the meeting started and some ideas that we talked about. But it's important to continue that type of a dialogue. And that dialogue should also continue to have the city and the Schenectady Police Department implement best practices that are currently in place and working well in other agencies. We're in America. We have shared problems and we share solutions. And I think we have to reach out. For example, we can enhance the training and de-escalation methods. What other agencies are having success with that particular thing? Create a local think tank to explore some methods. We have a great network of knowledge here in the capital region with local colleges, some specializing in criminal justice programs, and colleges and universities to provide some ideas and enhance the concept of procedural justice. Another thing is, we collectively have a community that has to preserve the investments that were made here to improve the city in other ways as well. We have to present our city as being a safe place to do business, a safe place to live, and a place that recognizes the need to improve in many areas. A number of years ago, I remember that there was an ad hoc committee from the Schenectady County Legislature that I once was part of. We looked at the possibility of having the Schenectady County Sheriff's Department serve as a central booking station for the entire county. That might be interesting to revisit it and look at it through the vision of today's standards, where sometimes the liability of detaining a person at a city lockup might not be the best place for that to happen. Such a move may even lower the liability for the city and allows the Sheriff's Department to do what they do best, which is handle and provide services for individuals that have been placed under arrest. There's proper medical care there. Prisoner watches are provided on site for those that need that type of level of care. So, again, just to regroup here, we've been talking about ways to improve, and I think we've got a lot of good ideas that were presented here tonight, and I'm sure many of the folks that are on the call that may have not spoken as yet may have other ideas, and I would encourage them to, send them in by way of the process that's allowed for that. So just some thoughts on that, just to kind of make the community a whole again.
Thank you for those comments, Frank. And yes, indeed, to really see the sweeping change that we'd like to see, a collaborative and collective effort, I think, is going to be needed. And, these task force are forming all throughout the state. And, I know that there can be some solution sharing among particularly the cities in our region that can kind of see what Schenectady can see what Albany's doing. Albany can see what Rensselaer's doing, and share solutions, share info. And I hear your point about the collective effort. Okay, we have about 9 minutes. Continued suggestions for making the department better, and continued tangible suggestions for that you would like to see addressed in the task force report.
So Jason, I'm going to jump in again. This is Andy Chestnut.
Yes, please.
So I think that this topic of improvement is so wide and so vast that it would actually, I'd mentioned before, data about breakdowns, looking at various things and how disproportionate they are, various subgroups within the community. And I think that would actually, if data like that would serve as a way to, as a lens to help us understand where our policies and procedures and practices are leading us astray, right? So if we have twice as many Guyanese people pulled over as we do white people, then we don't need to look at the policy book to know that there's a problem. We may not know what it is, how to solve it, but we've identified it, right? And so I think starting with the disproportionalities and working backwards is going to give a much better targeted way to make things better than just sort of looking at the whole policy book and say, maybe we should make a change on page 500, or maybe this paragraph needs to be a little bit shorter, a little bit longer. But if we start with the actual, gee, we're arresting twice as many of this group, subgroup as we are of that subgroup, you know, that I think is what will help us identify where the real problems are, so that we can focus our attention there. And hopefully, as whatever that issue gets improved, then we can expand it to other things which might be a problem but not as big. And thank you.
Point taken. Yes. So I'm hearing a reiteration of the stress of looking at data, looking at whatever trends the data can reveal to us in any given direction. And then where we see the data trending in a direction we don't want, to use that data and work backwards from there to get at the root of what might be causing that disparity in the data. Certainly. Got a little over 5 minutes, folks. So any closing remarks, any kind of final comments, any final suggestions you'd like to leave with the task force to consider?
Refresh the screen.
Oh, Mr. Terry, I see you there trying to speak.
Key to me right from the beginning was the fact that the police on beat, walking. I'm a nephew from Arthur Cheers, and that was a big thing for the police department, not just him, to know his area, and the area knew him. I think that's key for an officer to have to know about the bad and the good elements in his section. That makes a difference, and he knows, because not every area's got good and not every area's got bad people or into no good, but at least he knew where and who was what and how to treat where he went, where he was called for. And yeah, that's a very good key, but not everybody can work every area. So how you going to implement it or have them do it to find out that, I don't know, but I think that would be key for officers that like the area, can conduct themselves, adapt to their area, because everybody can't adapt to every kind of situation. So that's kind of where I stand.
Thank you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh,
go ahead.
So two things I would like to see, or suggestions. One, I would like to see the same kind of conversation happen between the police department, NAACP, all of us, and the faith-based community. I think it would be beneficial if all of those parties came together, because all of those voices need to be heard, and sometimes they have different perspectives, and they need to be heard at the same time. So I would like to see this conversation happen again with those parties in attendance. The other thing I want to say, I thank the task force for the work that they're going to do. I think you all understand that this is something that you're going to have to be in for the long haul. This is not a quick fix, but I want you to also be mindful of, while you are, taking steps to do the work, while we understand it's not something that's going to be fixed overnight. For the Black and Brown community, there is a very serious sense of urgency to this matter. It is literally a life or death issue for us. So while we, the police department and the government keep saying to us, it's going to take time, it's going to take time, it's going to take time. For us, there is no time. So please be mindful of that and sensitive to that as you are doing your work. I mean, to go through the process, but don't drag your feet.
Thank you for those comments, Reverend Harris. Anyone else would like to offer a closing comment or suggestion? Okay. Well, again, my name is Jason Benitez. I currently serve as the VP of Talent and Inclusion at the Capital Region Chamber. And as a representative and moderator for these conversations, I really want to thank you all. Everything that this call was recorded, it will be part of the official record, as will, if you feel like you'd like to offer a more thorough response to any of the written questions that were sent in the agenda, please respond to the SPD collaborative email and submit any written testimony that you'd like to submit. And this is an ongoing process with several conversations. So we will be collecting a lot of feedback throughout this process. So I'm going to turn it back over to the mayor or the chief for a closing comment. But I thank you all for being on this call, and I thank you all again for kind of presence you have in our communities, and blessings to everyone on this call this evening. Mayor or chief?
Yeah, thank you, Jason. Again, I want to thank everybody for being part of this dialogue tonight. I'm optimistic that the outcome is going to be significant and that we're all going to be proud of it. Turn it off to the chief if he has any final comments. And we have all these ministers here. We could close with a brief prayer also.
Sounds like a great idea.
I think it is a good idea. I'll be brief. I just want to thank everybody for your time tonight. I know your time is precious, and by volunteering your time to have such a great conversation and a very important conversation, I do appreciate it. And I guess, like the mayor said, if anybody wants to volunteer for a closing prayer, it would be much appreciated.
I'd be glad to. Father Isopo.
Thank you, Father.
Let us take this moment. Eternal God, we are so grateful for the many gifts and personalities and diversity of this city. We are grateful for those who volunteer their time, treasure, and talent to make a difference in the world. Tonight, we are mindful of those who are hungry, those who are living on the streets, and those who live in the path of war and violence. We may be empowered to share, to understand, to be transparent, and to truly lift up and celebrate the human person. We ask this in your name, and continue to guide us. Amen.
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 Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.
Good evening.
Good.